Well, let's start with some context of why he's in the news, and then we'll kick it off with like the proper intro. So Jeff Lewis has a great post here that we'll put up on the screen. He says, "You only have to be really right once. Masa has been really right twice. Third time tends to be a charm." And so Jeff's going long Masa, and Hiro Onoda Capital says 25 at 340 post. This is the rumored OpenAI round. And it's a quote. He says, "There are one business guys. Bill Gates just started Microsoft and Mark Zuckerberg just started Facebook. I am involved in 100 businesses and I control the entire tech ecosystem." Masa continued, "These are not my peers. The right comparison for me is Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Emperor Qin, builder of the Great Wall of China. I am not a CEO. I am building an empire." And that's the type of energy we love to see on the timeline. And so we got some photos of Masa, but let's kick it off with why you should care about this guy. He's back. He's in on Stargate. He's ripping huge checks. He lost a ton of money. It was embarrassed by WeWork, but he made a ton back on ARM. He's rich, he's powerful, and he's firmly back in the game. And so why don't you kick it off with his humble beginnings in early life?
Humble beginnings in early life. So he was born on the 11th of August in 1957 in Tosu, which is the southeastern part of Japan's Kyushu Island. He is a third-generation Korean.
Zainichi Korean.
Zainichi Korean, which are ethnic Koreans that were at some point or another granted permanent residency or citizenship in Japan. So before going into that, he actually, so going back to his grandpa, I'll pull up some notes here. His grandpa and his great grandpa were a part of this sort of agricultural class in Korea. And so they were not seen as businessmen, but they were seen as people that they were aristocrat adjacent. Their responsibility was sort of overseeing agriculture in Korea. And what's interesting about this is that his grandpa really internalized this. And so even though that aristocratic sort of agricultural class was disbanded in Korea and they eventually moved to Japan, he always saw himself as above business, like had a very negative view of business. He had a negative view of entrepreneurs, which is fascinating because Masa's dad, the grandpa's son, was very much an entrepreneur, and he went on to very much influence Masa in a big way and sort of catalyze.
You can just do things.
You can just do things, guys.
Breaking the rules. Build whatever he can.
So going back, Masa's dad was born in 1936. Masa.
Wow, he was just 21 when he had Masa.
Yeah, 36? So has a kid very young. Wow. Masa's one of 7.
Pronatalist going.
So
on
his very much. And so Masa's dad is living through World War. The sort of the end of World War II, right? Sort of this Japanese Reconstruction era. The Japanese were deeply embarrassed by World War II, right? They went from this sort of dominant empire that stretched all over Asia to being forced back onto the 4 islands. And they went through this Reconstruction period. And so as the Japanese were in a bad spot, they badly mistreated Koreans. Even during the war, the Koreans were... the men were forced to work in like coal mines and do these sort of tasks that were basically slave labor, and the women were like concubines, sort of sexual slaves. So very, very dark history. And so this is what Masa's grandpa is like going through as like an adult, basically. So he has a son, he has 7 kids, and Masa's dad even has memories of American B-29 bombers. Flying and bombing the nearby cities that they were in. And Masa's dad has this memory of walking up and touching the glass of a B-29 bomber that crashed. But Masa's dad at the time, as a kid, he decided that America was awesome.
Oh my God.
He says, like, there's a quote, he says, he's like, at that point, from that point on, I thought America rocked. That was like the summary, not word for word.
That's hilarious.
And so... After the war, Koreans are being treated terribly. There was a lot of pushback. Many of them were asked to leave. If you didn't leave, you were forced into these sort of shanty, ghettos, slums.
Japan's always been kind of a like light ethno state. Like they've never been big on immigration.
Yeah,
they're kind of changing their tune
like
now.
Go live there, but
it's hard to get
citizenship.
The population's collapsing, so things might change. But
and so
it's been rough. Even being Korean, not even being like an American, like, who would really stick out.
Yeah, and so
they lived in this illegally built shack on the railroad. You saw this? This
so
is
gnarly.
wild.
And so at one point they go. So Masa's dad goes back to Korea. They realize it's even worse there. There's no economy.
Yep.
Then they decide they're going to come back to Japan. They get on a boat. It's a multi-day crossing. Typically, it's like a couple days. The boat sinks, and they spend 2 days at sea, just like drifting around, and eventually get picked up, taken back to Korea, and then they finally make it back to Japan.
Wow.
And so, jumping forward a little bit, Japan at this point is still like a completely shattered economy, right?
Yeah.
They're rebuilding. They've lost so much ground. Masa's dad leaves school at 14 and is selling alcohol to basically support his family, right? He's one of 7. He's trying to put some food on the table.
He's an illegal sake business.
So Masa's dad starts a moonshine business. And at this point, his dad is a drunk, is beating him like frequently, very dark. And has at one point badly beats him because he was bragging. Masa's dad was bragging to his friends about his business success, right? He's like, I'm making moonshine, I'm making some bucks. His dad overhears it, ends up beating him for it. So Masa's born 10 years after the family gets back to Japan. They're completely at the bottom of society. So it's very much like Masa, by the time he's a teenager, his dad is kind of on top, not on top of the world, but they have a very flashy lifestyle. But he's born while his dad is living with their family in the slums, and they are pig farmers. And they chose pigs for a few specific reasons that I thought were interesting. So they, one, his dad had free labor because they have a big family and everybody's participating. They have free land because they're just living in this sort of like railroad ghetto, and the pigs just kind of roam around chilling. The Masa's grandma, who's a big part of raising him because his mom was very absent, takes Masa around in a wheelbarrow picking up scraps of food to feed the pigs. So this is just like, it's hard to even illustrate how rough of a situation they're in. But anyways, his dad picks pigs because they reproduce super quickly. The pigs are just,
it's like very hustle mindset, but very limited opportunities and like low class.
And so eventually through this sort of raising pigs, selling them off to be, butchered for food, Masa's dad starts saving up some money. At one point he has the equivalent of 100,000 USD, which was a lot of money back then. And Masa, this really gets into kind of understanding who he is. His dad starts to get into this thing called pachinko, which is this new form of gambling, which is effectively via slot machines. So this still is very much around in Japan. So his dad just starts getting into the game a little bit. He's gone from pig farming to gambling. An absolute dog.
But he's on the casino side.
He's on the house.
He's not gambling the family money away. This is important.
But he still has to take some pretty big gambles. So anyways, these are picture like casinos, and is not that dissimilar to what Vegas looks like today, where it's just rows and rows of these machines and people just sit there. And over time, he's sort of levering up. He's launching different, parlors here and there. At one point, he takes a huge bet and spends $4 million on a new club. They called casino. And it's called Lions. And so this was like the vast majority of the capital that he had available. So huge bet. And for the bet to pay off, he needed to get 5,000 to 10,000 people per day gaming in this facility, which is an order of magnitude more than his like best performing club. So it's literally the most like Giga Chad long move that a lot of people are like, you are absolutely crazy. And his dad is on record saying, I don't care if I go bust. And he even had contingency plans. He's like, if I go bankrupt, like we'll go on the run. He's like, I'll run it all back.
Wow.
And so this is the environment that Masa is growing up in as like sub 10 years old, which is just crazy environment. And so he launches this club. First 2 weeks absolutely flops. And he's like obviously freaking out, but wants to really make a play. So he takes like a $350,000 loss in the first month. He's like, I got to turn this around. He works with his engineers to make it so that the machines like pay out a lot more and people start winning a lot, and he starts attracting this flood of people. And so the next month he changes it and he makes $350K of profit.
There you go.
And then the next month, they're kind of messing with the machines. He loses it back again. So he's the sons are just like not afraid to like make it all, lose it all, make it all, lose it all. And eventually he sort of slowly dials it in. And so by the time Masa's, I believe it's 14, the family's now living this sort of dual lifestyle where they have 20 members of the family that are working on the family business, but then there's also the sort of older generation. And so it's this weird dichotomy where the people that are working in the business are like driving like flashy cars and like really like living it up, right? They have all these sort of casinos. And then the grandparents are like kind of still around, but like very much still living in the past in some way. And so we can get more into Masa's, life and career, but I think that's very important context because the sort of gambler's mindset and entrepreneur, like high risk entrepreneurship is 100% in his DNA. It's all he knows. Yeah. So when people we're like, oh, how could Masa put $10 billion into, WeWork and lose it all? It's like, well, he's lost more money than any other man in history, in the entire history of the world, in our sort of modern economy. He's lost
$70 billion during the .com crash.
Yeah.
The highest number ever.
He was also the rich. So he went from being the richest man in the world to losing like 90
in history.
Yeah.
And crazy.
So
yeah. And so I think
insane.
through the gambling business and through kind of their family growing, he meets this guy, Den Fujita, who is an entrepreneur who brought McDonald's to Japan. And this guy is a psycho. He has this quote. He says, if the Japanese eat McDonald's for 1,000 years, they'll grow taller, have white skin, and blonde hair. Like, it's like they'll basically turn into Donald Trump. I think it's so funny that the dude's just like, oh yeah, like this is like Trump code. This is Trump maxing, basically.
Trump maxing.
And so Fujita acts as like a mentor to Masa and tells him, go study English, learn about the computer industry, and you got to go to America. And so Masa has this outsider complex. He's like, yes, I'm like the lowest rung of society. Yeah, my family's from this like destitute, shack, and we're still looked down on as kind of like gamblers and like, lower class. But I'm keeping the name. I'm not changing my name, and I'm going to prove that I can do it.
No, and the cool thing, so Masa's dad had a, I don't know the exact dynamic, but very rough relationship with an abusive father who's an alcoholic. Masa's dad is awesome though, and like from a young age is training Masa and saying, you are the best, you are number one, anything you want you can achieve. Like it's honestly like I went from being I was listening to this being like very emotional because it was so dark, and then it flips and Masa's dad is you can just do things, anything you can see in your mind you can achieve, and Masa really carries that into the rest of his career.
Oh yeah, totally. So he goes to California at age 16, joins this college before entering high school, and he advances from sophomore to junior to senior in 2 weeks by just testing out of everything. And he spent 2 full years at the college, then transferred to UC Berkeley to study economics while also taking some computer science classes. And he has this idea where he needs to generate business ideas. And so he generates one new business idea every single day.
He would have loved My First Million.
Oh yeah, My First Million. Or just like, your path of just like building a deck, spinning up an idea, tweeting something out, and then being like, actually, this is a business. Yeah, the idea sucks. But he was just throwing stuff at the wall. I remember in my first startup, we were like destitute, and we had a wall of sticky notes. It's just like all the different business ideas. And some days we would just pull one out and be like, can we build an MVP for this? And like eventually it started working, which is great. So he sells a patent for a translation device to Sharp Electronics. So it seems like he does have some sort of technical background, even though later on he becomes deeply vibe-based investor.
He's just not an engineer, and he never identified as an engineer. He is the in the grand scheme, he's the Japanese Warren Buffett. So you should look at him as like a deal maker, somebody that's seeing opportunities, putting people, capital, and ideas together, and doing it on a global scale.
And so Sharp pays him $1.7 million for that patent, which is crazy considering how young he is at the time. It's a huge windfall back this was before 1980, so this is in the 70s. He gets $2 million basically. And so he immediately invested all in importing Space Invaders arcade machines, modifying the software and installing them on campus. And that makes him another $1 million. And then he founds a game software company and he sells that for $2 million. So he has a bunch of like back-to-back hits really, really quickly.
Yep.
And so then he returns to Japan in the early 80s, and he starts doing extensive research. So he's just kind of monk mode. He's made his money in America enough to like, buy some time. And he's just spending 18 months doing extensive research. All of his relatives are like, this guy's doing nothing. But secretly, he was building a massive knowledge base.
Yep.
So he developed 20 metrics to measure potential business ideas. And the highest scoring idea for him was personal software distribution. And this goes into his deal-making philosophy. He's not building the software. That's complicated. That's risky. He's just taking software that already works and just buying it for cheap and selling it to someone else.
Distribution businesses have existed for years.
Yeah.
They're great businesses. You usually don't have to take on too much inventory risk.
Totally.
But you get this sort of toll booth style.
Yeah, not
business.
R&D heavy, very bootstrappable. I know some people that own food and bev distribution companies, and like they just print money and they don't, and they never raised any money. It's like this amazing family-owned business.
Yep.
And so this. And this also like just it super aligns with his skill set at this point. Like he understands what good software is, obviously, because he's built a game company, ran the Space Invaders thing. But if you think about, you get a call from somebody who's like in their early 20s, they've already sold like 3 companies. Like they have money. They're really like this crazy hustler with this interesting backstory. Yeah. Like you're going to take that meeting even though they're young.
Yeah.
And so that's the ultimate alpha is just he's like such a hustler, has enough of a track record to get the meeting. Yeah. And then it's like, oh yeah, you're providing me a service. Like I need software to distribute through my stores anyway. So why don't I go with you?
Yeah. And that's why when, because today the younger generation of entrepreneurs really know Masa for going giga long,
turbo long
on WeWork. But that's
not the story.
So 50 years earlier, he had his 20 metrics to measure business ideas. And so he takes massive risk. And oftentimes there is a sort of vibes-based analysis, which some of his employees talk about, right? But in general, he's one of the most well-studied, well-researched, most experienced deal makers in history.
Totally. And
there's not like he does get some really lucky breaks, but it's not necessarily luck, right? Because he's taking so many crazy shots on goal.
Yeah, and so he chooses the name SoftBank. Think about it as like a bank of software. It's not actually a financial institution, but it kind of turns into one or a huge fund at a certain point. And so he hires 2 part-time people in a small office. He's not afraid to hustle. And then famously, he would get an Apple box because he's short and stand on them and declare, in 5 years, we'll have $75 million in sales, supplying 1,000 outlets, and we'll be number 1 in PC software distribution. And the 2 employees were like, this guy's crazy. We quit immediately. Imagine giving a speech to your only 2 employees. Imagine we're like, Ben, this is going to be the most profitable podcast. We are going to crush it. We're going to be number 1 this year. And Ben just is like, I'm good.
I'm out. On that note, I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, if he saw us stand on an Apple box, maybe that would be the trigger for that. But hilarious. And so, but he doesn't mind. He grinds through it. And so he books a giant booth the size of Sony Toshiba's at a Tokyo trade show. Even though he's like this small company, he's just sending it.
So smart.
Like, it's so smart. He's standing out. This is the friend.com Alvi thing. Like he's doing the thing where everyone's like, no one would take that amount of risk. And then it gets him a bunch of attention. And so he invited vendors to exhibit for free. And so he's like, I got this booth. I'll let you do it for free. I'm going to advertise you for free. And he's just pulling forward value basically. And so it feels like a flop. There's no immediate leads, but weeks later, Joshin Denki from Osaka contacted him. And originally, this is hilarious because he's made millions of dollars at this point.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey, we're this software firm. Why don't you come and pitch us and we'll see if we can do a deal? And he's like, I don't have enough money to afford a train ticket. Like I literally can't go.
So I would love to know how he probably did the most degenerate things with all that cash.
Of course.
He's probably going long like
of course
Russian corn futures. Just like uses it all.
Yeah, I mean he's just investing it. I think he literally spent a ton of it on that trade show booth and just spending it on like all these crazy long shots.
Oh yeah,
they don't
imagine
pan out.
in an era when Tokyo's biggest software trade show to actually get a booth the size of Sony
or Toshiba.
You might have had to spend
$1 million or something, or a ton. And so the president of Joshin Denki calls him and says, we need a dedicated software supplier. We want you to be the one to do it. And he says,
and this is such an interesting time, right? Because this is at a time where companies were R&D product companies, but they wouldn't do their own distribution. So to sell, they would just find a distributor that would be the primary sales channel for them. Right?
I mean, this was up until the internet. Like we're in 1981 or something, and all the way up to 2000, you would have to go to what was it, CompUSA or Best Buy or Fry's Electronics, and I remember buying video games on discs in like boxes, and you'd take that home.
That's why GameStop was a great business.
Yeah,
it's because the manufacturers or the game makers didn't actually have.
And if you just think about it, like there's obviously some sort of power law where Best Buy is probably the biggest one. GameStop's big, like you mentioned. But there are hundreds or thousands of individual small software box retail stores.
Yep.
And then there's also thousands of game companies and software companies and somebody making spreadsheets. You forget that before Microsoft condensed all of Office, like PowerPoint was its own company. I'm pretty sure Excel was its own company. And they like put all these together. Almost all of that was through M&A. And so at a certain point, if you're the guys who are like, we're making presentation software, we're going to call it PowerPoint or whatever, you're like, okay, we have some cracked engineers. We built it. It works. It's good. But like now we got to sell it into 1,000 different retail stores. Like we have to have a massive sales force. It makes perfect sense to disaggregate that and work with the distributor. And so that's what they do. But Masa gets this phone call, and they're saying, we need a dedicated software supplier for Joshin Denki. And Masa says, I have no product, no money, and little experience, but I have the greatest desire to succeed. And I will pour my entire spirit into PCs.
Let's go.
Let's go. Full send.
So one thing you'll know about Masa that's important to know is from a very young age, he intensely practiced manifestation and visualization. So he would have loved LA in the 2000s because this guy, I'm sure he's a big feng shui, enthusiast as well. But he would, in his view, from early in his career, if he could visualize it, he could make it real.
Yep.
And so that has kind of bit him in a little bit throughout, the last few years, where he'll just announce a huge deal before it's done.
Yep.
And in his mind, he's like, I can see it in my mind. It's done. We're going to do it. Right.
Yep.
And that bit him a little bit with WeWork, because I'm sure when he was investing at WeWork at a $44 billion valuation, he just imagined a world where WeWork had office buildings, hotels, apartments,
everything.
All these, campuses. Right.
Yep.
And so he's like, of course, he was not analyzing it based on their EBITDA at the time. It was entirely based on what he visualized, and he believed in Adam Neumann. In many ways, Adam Neumann was an amazing CEO from a storytelling, narrative, brand building standpoint.
Yeah, yeah.
And so in his mind, WeWork was already a $100 billion company, so it seemed like he's buying it for cheap, right? He's like, you're the idiots, right?
Yeah, I mean,
because he could see it in his mind.
Even WeWork, like, it's not like WeWork. People like to put WeWork in the same bucket as like Theranos, but it's just not true at all. Like, this was a benchmark company. Like, this was like they were very much like a serious contender in Silicon Valley, whereas Theranos is like this weird zombie.
The other thing with WeWork is the fundamental consumer product was amazing.
Yeah,
do you remember walking into early WeWorks? I remember being, in college, probably going to my first WeWork, and I'm like, the coffee's free and good.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing.
It's great.
It was like a fun vibe. Everyone was friendly. Maybe it's not the highest productivity space in the world.
It was on a mega trend of like more remote work, more distributed teams, more small teams, more startups.
It felt like the pricing, part of why the product was so good is because they were not selling it for what it cost to deliver.
Totally.
But it still was like, okay, at $400 a month, it'd be stupid not to get this because I'm getting so much value.
Totally. And so Masa, the deal maker, comes out in full force with the Joshin Denki deal. He says, first off, you got to break off other vendor relationships. You got to go exclusive if you want to be with me, but I will work extra hard for you. Yep. And then he also really pitches them on this idea that the software is key to them winning in hardware. So the idea is like, if Joshin Denki wants to sell a lot of hardware, they're going to need the best software in their stores, and people will come come for the software, and then they'll buy a new computer. And that virtuous cycle will drive value for Joshin Denki. He's not wrong there. Like, that is a good pitch. And so he secures the deal, and he also importantly gets Joshin Denki to pay for product inventory, covering Masa's shortfall. So all of a sudden he doesn't have a working capital problem. And so even though he's very small and doesn't have a lot of funding raised or anything, he can basically bootstrap this up.
Joshin deserves. Hopefully Masa went back after all of this and was just like,
got some warrants.
Here's a boat.
Here's a boat like or something.
That, something to pay him back, because it seems like Joshin just made it a really risky bet.
I mean, look at this growth.
He's a force. He was always a force.
Always a force. And so Masa takes SoftBank from $10,000 in monthly revenue to $2.3 million in monthly revenue. And remember, there's no inventory cost here. So it's all like effectively software margins. Like, he doesn't have the working capital, like the debt issue that normally comes up. He's printing. And so he IPOs in 1994 at a valuation of $3 billion. And by the early 1990s, SoftBank was Japan's largest distributor of PC software.
He manifested this.
And he was extremely wealthy, but far from done. Should we move on to the dot-com boom and bust?
Yeah, this is like, we're just getting started.
We're just getting started. Buckle in, folks. We got another hour at least on this, baby. So he moves to Silicon Valley in 1995. He sets up offices in Mountain View, seeing the internet's enormous potential. And 1995, this is still early on the dot-com boom. It's not like he YOLO'd in at the top in 2000. Like, he did that also.
He also did that.
But he also got in early, and that was very valuable. And so the dot-com boom was in full swing. Companies were rushing to harness the web's explosive growth, but this was still pre-IPO craze. Go public with just a slide deck and a domain name. And so in 1996, he meets the Yahoo co-founders, Jerry Yang and David Filo. He offers them $100 million for 30% of Yahoo. That's a big stake. Typical VC funds at the time rarely wrote $100 million checks, because that could alone be 40% of a fund.
Yeah, this is so normalized now, but the biggest funds back in the day were like
$100
the classic
million
solo GP fund today.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah. And like, you would just raise from VCs for a seed round or a Series A, Series B, and then IPO. Yeah. Google IPO'd very early. Obviously, it was a different thing because they were cash flow positive. But even the money losers would IPO and use the capital markets in the public capital markets to raise money. Exactly.
Nowadays, when companies IPO, they're oftentimes it's not even about the money; it's about the liquidity for the shareholders.
It's like, well, I raised a couple $1 million just from angels. Then there were a bunch of huge venture capital firms that could write a $20 million Series A check, no problem. Then there were growth funds. Then there were crossover hedge funds. Then I started just going to the direct LPs and being like, can I raise a couple billion from a sovereign wealth fund just directly in the private market? All before IPO, and that's why you see companies IPOing at 60 or 100 billion.
So listen to this quote. Masa after he made this offer, he gave the Yahoo founders an ultimatum. He says, "If you don't take my money, I'll invest in Excite or Lycos, which were competitors, and kill you."
The funniest
He's just
thing
making death threats.
The funniest thing about this quote is that he didn't even know who their competitors were. In the meeting, he asks, "Who do you think your biggest competitors are?" And they say, probably Excite or Lycos. He's like, okay, well then, if you don't take the money, I'm investing in them. Thanks for doing my DD for me. Ultimate deal maker. Didn't do any research. Still wins the deal.
And so it's this interesting, because he breaks all the trends of, he's exactly the opposite of Warren Buffett.
Totally.
Right. Warren Buffett is heavily researched, sort of slow, moving, builds these positions, over time. Takes a position, then starts marketing it, things like that. He's the opposite, where he's coming in, and he's clearly brilliant and gifted and a brilliant entrepreneur. But from an investment standpoint, he breaks all the rules, right?
Yeah.
He's not even doing market research before offering to do $100 million investment.
Crazy.
Take
to
these
not know the competitors.
Yeah.
And just be like, yeah, I like you guys, but also I will kill you if you don't let me invest. And so Yahoo accepts the $100 million offer. They IPO in 1996, like very shortly after this deal goes through, and the share price soared on day one. Masa made $150 million immediately. And
which, again, at this point in time, doesn't really make a dent in his net worth, right? Like he had taken SoftBank public at a $3 billion market cap. Sure, 150 extra bones is not a bad thing.
I mean, Yahoo continued to rip post IPO all the way.
I know.
And I'm
just saying, I think you'll realize through looking at Masa's, the reason that later in his life he starts to make these crazy size lord giga chad omega long bets is because he's had instances like later when he invests in Alibaba and prints tens and tens of billions of dollars.
Yep.
You know that he wished he just massively sized up that position.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
And so that leads to these sort of 10.
He understands concentration.
Right now
there's too many VCs who are like, yeah, I'm in this amazing company. I got 0.25%. You know, because I got diluted
just
down.
A logo at that point.
And I got crammed down on this one round. I couldn't get to the ownership percentage, and the founders only wanted to do a 10% round, and I only took 2% of it. All this stuff, but I mean, Yahoo, like the wealth creation at Yahoo is really underrated in the Silicon Valley story. Like when I got to Silicon Valley, you'd meet a lot of Gen Xers, and a lot of them were like, "Oh yeah, I was early at Yahoo," and then you're like, "Okay, this person's like cool and like kind of smart, but not like." Generational talent. You go to their house, like a $40 million mansion in like Menlo Park, because there was just so much wealth created from that IPO and a lot of liquidity. Yeah. And so it was a huge thing that led to, a rarefied air around anyone associated with Yahoo. And then also just a kind of a Yahoo mafia that spawned and built a bunch of companies. And it was kind of like the Facebook of the day, but it didn't have staying power whatsoever. Yep. And so it eventually unwound. So once he gets liquidity from that, he's hooked on deal making. And so from 1996 to 2000, he invests in 250 internet startups, doing a deal a week. Yeah. And he emphasizes.
And there were some weeks where, some weeks he probably did 5. Oh yeah. And other weeks he was back in his Tokyo pad.
Yeah. He's making calls. Okay. Yeah. What is it? Oh, who are your competitors? Okay. I'll invest in them. Okay.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, a lot of his career, he had his time in the Valley, but a lot of his career he spent working and living in Tokyo. Yep. And just sporadically traveling to places like Davos, or California, things like that.
And so he's basically just making he's not trying to pick winners. He's just trying to ride the internet wave. So he's not doing a lot of due diligence, enormous volume. And it's a good bet at the time.
He created the Tiger Global
Tiger
playbook.
model was the same thing. Tiger just timed it terribly. But
Tiger actually did way more due diligence because they would hire like Bain Consulting.
It was still pretty quick.
Still like they were doing market research.
Totally.
Masa's just vibes based, ripping checks.
Yeah. And I mean, we should do the Tiger story at some point, but they were very active in Asia around this time, shortly after this.
And so
made a ton of money there.
Masa's not just scaling the investments, he's scaling the firm. So he launches basically teams in South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Australia, India, Mexico, Brazil,
taking over
Argentina.
The world.
So all over the last decade, you've had VCs being like, oh yeah, we're doing a lot in LATAM. Yep. We're doing stuff in India. Yeah. We got bets in Pakistan. Yeah. And meanwhile, Masa's already been in all those places, just spamming checks.
Spamming checks. It's great.
It's like you on the with the
Delt machine.
The,
spam them. And so he makes $15 billion in just a few years, and he starts to double down once he meets Jack Ma of Alibaba. And so Alibaba's scaling. They need additional capital. Goldman Sachs, who was Alibaba's previous investor, was reluctant to keep funding it, didn't really see the massive potential there, and was looking at more on a spreadsheet basis. And so Masa meets Chinese...
First mistake.
Yeah, for sure.
Ignore spreadsheets.
For sure. And so he meets Chinese tech entrepreneurs, and he sees a glint in Ma's eyes.
And one thing about Masa is like you need to understand this run as he is a degenerate gambler because like he grew up in casinos, like these pachinko clubs,
and he had so many wins.
And like his dad was fully comfortable with making going up one month and losing it all the next month, and just keeping it rolling.
Yeah, beta.
Yeah,
beta. And so they shake on a deal, $20 million on a $100 million valuation, but he winds up getting 34% of Alibaba through as the deal progresses. And so the critical advantage here is that Masa sat on Cisco's board and saw router sales to China exploding, indicating massive internet expansion. Yeah. So he got some insider intel, understood the market was growing, and went in, found a targeted bet, and ripped a check. What's probably missing from this story is that he probably wrote 100 other $20 million checks, and none of them went anywhere. But it doesn't matter because he got the elephant. He bagged the elephant. And so the dot-com crash was rough for him.
Wait, let's talk about the Alibaba investment real quickly. So he turned $20 million into a $72 billion position, which I think is actually the greatest.
I think it might be.
The greatest venture bet of all time.
Yep. It's hard to measure because I think it sold off a ton during the .com crash, but at the current valuation, and I think he still owns a huge chunk of Alibaba, right? Because that was one of the positions that they were thinking about unwinding to do the Stargate deal.
Yeah.
So interest rates rise in 2000. The stock market plummets, and many .coms with shaky business models went bankrupt. SoftBank's market cap plunged 99%. Classic.
Yeah, and so to be clear, so this was in March of 2000. In January, he was giving a talk in Tokyo at this like very kind of cool underground sort of disco type club to all these, and the Japanese culture at the time was very much salary men, you worked a good income, and it was sort of seen as boring. And so Masa got all these guys in a room, and it's been described as being almost like a get rich quick scheme, because he was pointing around the room being like, you're going to be worth $50 million. You're going to be worth $100 million. You're going to be worth $100 million. And just like going around the room like that. And it really seemed like that. And he genuinely believed it.
Totally.
And I'm sure many of those people went on to start, important companies, but I do believe that at every market top, he still believed, which is why he gets smoked, right?
Oh, yeah.
He's not the guy. He doesn't really.
No, he never sells early.
He never sells early.
Yep. Which is a drawback for a lot of big investors who have the ability to find fantastic entrepreneurs, see trends, but then they get pessimistic at the last second and say, this must be capping out. I've made so much money. I mean, the whole benchmark Uber story, people are like, maybe that was like, they were like looking at, well, we're each going to take home $1 billion individually. Like, this is retirement money. Maybe we got to get out, something like that. And there's a little bit of internal, devil on the shoulder telling you, hey, this is too good to pass up. But even though he's losing so much money, he personally lost $70 billion, which is a record at the time. Alibaba is surviving.
Do we hit the size?
I think we take a moment of silence.
A moment of silence, but it's almost like losing $70 billion means you made that much, which should be
gone but not forgotten. Let's hit the size gong just a little bit. Boom. There we go.
For the run up and the run down.
And so he makes it through with the Alibaba stake, and then he starts launching more companies. Yahoo Broadband, Japan Telecom, Vodafone Japan, rebranded as SoftBank Mobile.
And this was smart because he found the area of tech that had durable revenues.
Totally.
Right? People would pay for an internet connection. They would pay for cell service, things
and disaggregated from the application layer.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if Yahoo wins or Google wins or Excite wins. If you own the broadband demand is going to increase.
And today he still has a huge position in T-Mobile. So there's certain positions that
he just
merge. Kept riding. But so the chaos of the post 2000, the actual like .com crash was because there were all these businesses that Masa was hugely invested in that were like dogs.com. And it'd be like basically a service where you could buy dogs online, and it turned out that people were still just buying dogs from regular kennels and stuff like that.
And so you can think about the early 2000s as kind of like back to the basics, rebuilding with like the less frothy companies, riding the Alibaba stock, rebuilding SoftBank back up. And then in 2010, he releases this 30-year vision presentation, and this thing is a bombshell. In June of 2010, it's a 133 slide deck with outsized predictions like advancements in artificial intelligence will surpass the human brain, life expectancy in Japan will reach 200 years, and a new era of hyper-connected communication will be upon us. And so his central philosophy is the information revolution will bring happiness for everyone.
So I love that even today he does
similar things.
He's a master marketer and salesman, right? He's a deal maker, so he's got to sell these deals. And he would even, despite his limited English, he would know the simple words to say: information revolution to bring happiness for everyone. Right? It's very sort of simple.
It's very intelligible. It's not. It's not techie mumbo jumbo about scaling curves and H100s and all this other stuff. It's like
and even his more recent decks have these very simplified.
Graphics.
People, they're so simple.
People make fun of them.
people make fun of them, but then they end up being correct.
Yep, they do.
In many ways.
And so the Vision Fund is born in 2017. He conceptualizes it in 2016 during a flight to the Middle East. He wrote down a target of $30 billion, then crossed it out in favor of $100 billion.
What did he say? He said, "Life's too short to think small."
Yeah.
And so
just tripling the size of your raise. Just, let's go big.
One of the greatest, probably the greatest fundraiser of all time. Sam Altman's very good at fundraising, yet he still has to go to Masa to really get the job done.
Yeah, Elon's great too, but it's a very different style of pitch, more driven by the science and the technology.
So he has this famous 45-minute pitch where he's meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. In Masa's words, he says, "I want to give you $1 trillion gift. If you invest $100 billion, I'll turn it into $1 trillion." So MBS ultimately invested $45 billion on the spot, catapulting the Vision Fund into existence. They also add a bunch of other investors. Apple's in the Vision Fund, Qualcomm,
Foxconn,
UAE's Mubadala, sort of sovereign wealth fund.
And SoftBank puts in $28 billion.
Yeah.
The funny thing about this is that he goes to MBS and is like, "You got to invest $100 billion, I'll turn it into $1 trillion." And MBS is like, "That's crazy, but I'm still going to give you 45."
Yeah.
It's like a total shoot
good for my 45.
I'm good for my 45. And it's funny because his original target was 30. He sized it up and still exceeded that with the first check.
Yeah. And there's been this idea in tech that Middle Eastern money is easy to get.
Yeah.
And that perception is only because there's a lot of capital out there. Mm-hmm. These relationships take a lot of time.
Yeah.
I know a ton of allocators that have had to go visit the Middle East 10 plus times before getting anything done. And so it's not like this was easy. Masa made it look easy because he just rolled over there. He was thinking about doing 30, crossed it out. He liked the 100 to $1 trillion. But this was, again, a very credible feat by itself. And then SoftBank commits $28 billion of the fund. What Masa has done historically, I don't know exactly, but he also makes venture investments using leverage, which is kind of a tricky situation to get in because venture investments can go down all the way to zero, right? And yet he still owes that money to someone.
You need the cash flow,
and so he would use SoftBank's actual earnings to help back that up, but then also would lever up other positions. So he would raise debt against some of his specific positions.
Alibaba stock
and so all throughout this, even from the early 1990s to now, he's gone almost bust in like smaller ways that don't even make it into the story because he's just levering up, just going long. He doesn't, I don't think this man has ever been short. He
doesn't have any middle of the road outcomes.
Yeah.
It's all 10 baggers or zeros, which is great.
Well, in the case of Alibaba, a
10,000 bagger. Yeah. So he focuses on AI, robotics, IoT, and consumer tech. He makes bets on Uber, WeWork, ByteDance, Didi, DoorDash, Grab, and then quirkier startups like Zoom for robot pizza and Wag for dog walking. And it's funny because 3 of those are companies that have been like, "Oh, this is such a silly idea. It never was going to work. He was so stupid for doing it." And then Uber, ByteDance, Didi, DoorDash, Grab, all banger companies. All very, very good.
Yeah. And one thing you'll notice here, he does not, he has no issues investing cross-border. So he has big presence in the US. He has a big presence in China. And so he's one of the few that's actually threading. I mean, of course, some American venture capital firms have gone and raised Chinese money or invest in China, but he's getting into the best Chinese companies, ByteDance, Didi, the Uber of China.
Yeah.
He's and so really he's a truly global deal maker. He can go into any room and make stuff happen.
And he's really good at being the capital that bridges these huge deals. Like I'm pretty sure the Uber and Didi deal, like having SoftBank bridge those 2 companies and put money into both in like this interesting way is like what kind of facilitated that. And that's just like a wild card. It's kind of the same thing that's happening with Stargate, where he comes in and all of a sudden like Larry Ellison is with Sam Altman and it's like more of this like Avengers style team coming together because there's so much capital on the table. Everyone's like, okay, I'm marching to the same beat of this drum because
he's oftentimes has the conviction to make stuff happen that otherwise would have never been a part of history.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
I recently invested in a founder who will go unnamed that took a couple $100 million from a vision fund during 2021. Nice. And the pressure that he faced immediately after investment to deploy it, because in hindsight, he's like, how did I spend that much money in such a short period of time? Company ended up, selling. It wasn't a good outcome. Yep. But he just said the relentless pressure of like, we gave you this money. Yeah. 100x your business this year.
There's also this interesting dynamic with SoftBank. I've heard from some folks that have had SoftBank on their board that even though Masa might come in, there's this example with WeWork, he gave Adam Neumann, the founder of WeWork, $3 billion on the first meeting and told him to be crazier. So the CEO and Masa, they get together, they have a short meeting and it's like the deal's done. But then SoftBank actually comes in and puts in like crazy infrastructure in the board. And so if you sit on a board with a SoftBank board member, there will be audit committees, compensation committees, like they run it like a public company basically. Yeah. And so a lot of investors like hate that because they're like, I'm used to having like a 1 hour strategy meeting with my boys. And now I'm like doing like paperwork, which I'm not down with. I just want to let the CEO cook and just do whatever.
Yeah. And in many ways,
but it's interesting.
And in many ways, early on, I think investors would say, this is amazing. Vision fund, very early, just gave a company that I invested in at an $8 million valuation. They just gave them $100 million, right? It's a crazy valuation. So the markup's great. Company's super capitalized, but then over time, it ends up being seen as more of a kiss of death because a lot of these companies, unless you were this generational outcome like Uber or DoorDash,
and you're really ready to deploy that money.
Yeah, and you're legitimately a phenomenal business that's already has some maturity versus something like, Zoom, like the robot pizza company where there's tons of competition. There's clearly no real network effect.
It's called the suicide round. I like that. I like that terminology. It's great.
And
there's been a few of them. They lost money on WeWork, obviously, which we've talked about. They lost money on Wirecard, the German payments processor, which collapsed after accounting fraud. Greensill Capital melted down, and many vision fund startups lacked profitability.
What was Greensill? Was it a fund they invested in?
Greensill, I don't remember. I thought it was like housing or energy or something like that, and it was a big blow up. And so there's been a lot of those, but he's still in the game.
Yeah, and it's tough. Like the reason why these rounds ended up being the kiss of death is if you're not profitable, then you raise $300 million and you spend it all. Yeah. Then you're sitting on this massive preference stack. Nobody else wants to back the company because it's going to be tough to get any money out unless like everything goes perfectly.
And the number's so big, you think like, oh wow, he gave Adam Neumann $3 billion and like it basically went to zero. Like that's so embarrassing. And then you realize that in 2021, SoftBank posted an annual net profit of $46 billion.
Yep.
It's like enough to cover what? 10 of those investments, 15 of those investments without blinking. And so you look at the GP commit on the vision fund, they put in what, 26 or something, billion. 28 billion on 100.
They can do that all day.
They could do that all day. And it's just like, the numbers are so big, you can't analyze them like it's a traditional fund because it's backed by this organization that's just printing cash from all of their holdings.
Yeah. But now I think their actual net income is in the single digit billions. So that was a specific moment in time where they had a lot of things go right, which was just due to COVID and interest rates.
But he doesn't quit. You only need one. You only need a couple
wins
to make it all back. Yeah, that's basically what he does every single time. And so in 2022, 2023.
And this history, going back again to his childhood, he was conscious when his dad was willing to bankrupt the family to go when they were already super successful, right? So a lot of people look at this and it's like, Masa, you've made all these amazing investments. You built one of the biggest companies in Japan. You've been the world's richest man. Why are you still taking on all this risk? And the answer is he's playing the greatest, biggest game that he can play, right? Which is...
And so, you were right that a year later in 2022, they announced a $27 billion loss. And so they lose money on Klarna. There's a Chinese tech crackdown. And so Alibaba and Didi get hammered by PRC regulations. Very hard to make money as a private investor in China, especially if you're Japanese instead of Chinese. And then it emerges in 2022 to 2023 that he personally owes SoftBank $5 billion due to side deals gone awry.
He's just ripping. So he's got his main deals,
and he's just like,
he's got his side deals,
and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm good for it. Like I'll put this on the ramp card.
Yeah.
Just hit up SoftBank. They'll take care of this $1 billion loss.
Yeah.
And so Masa says,
yeah, and this is evident of the way that he operates, which is he is such a force that he's traveling all over the world, doing deals, committing to things, announcing things that haven't been actually finalized yet.
Yep.
And then telling his team, all right, just make it happen. So it's shouldn't be that surprising to anyone that after the chaos of 2020 to 2023, he just happened to owe his own company $5 billion because of some other stuff that probably didn't even make it into the news. You know?
It's remarkable. And so he shook it off. He says, when it rains, you open an umbrella. And he's repeatedly insisted that he's embarrassed by the fund's performance, but remains an unshakable optimist. And we saw that come back, and we didn't even get to ARM. You know, he turned something like 20 billion into an 80 billion gain. He's back in the game, and he is making AI deals now, ripping checks into OpenAI, working on Stargate. He's just not going anywhere.
He's the deal maker, tech mogul that he clearly has a very powerful, very well known in our corner of the internet.
Yep.
But if you actually go ask people that maybe even are in tech but don't really follow the game closely, they won't know him.
Yep.
And the story is just truly incredible. Grows up in not just poor, but abject poverty, living with pigs.
Yeah.
He said he has a consistent nightmare around waking up, having these nightmares that he's smelling the pig sort of fumes, right? And he wakes up in shock, right? And so to go from that abject poverty to the richest man in the world, was born in poverty, made his first million in America before he turned 20.
Yeah.
Runs it down to zero again, runs it back up, back down to 99% down, runs it back up.
This
funny. Man
doesn't quit.
He can't be broke.
No,
he's he should launch a course.
Yeah.
At this point, if he ever got down bad enough, he just could launch a course.
Well, it's so funny because this week that Hacker News comment went viral. That's entrepreneurship is throwing darts at the dartboard at a carnival. If you're middle class, you get one throw. If the rich kids get as unlimited throws, and the poor kids are working the carnival. And this guy has gotten so many throws, and he came from nothing. Just complete invalidation.
He makes his own throws.
Yeah, he just figures it out. And it's funny because that always goes viral, and people are like, oh, this is so true. This hits so hard. I looked up the dude who posted it. He's never launched a startup. He's never even tried.
Yeah.
And so it's clearly just cope, just being I can't do it because I'm too poor or something.
Yeah.
And clearly there's a million ways to start the flywheel. And then once you're on the flywheel, you get extra shots because it's your last company didn't do well, but you probably learned a lot and you were CEO.
Yeah, he went in that when he was in that nightclub talking to all the Japanese at that time, it was not normal. Venture capital didn't really exist in Japan in the same way it does in America. And he gave this story. He's in America, an entrepreneur can start 4 companies. They all fail. And on the 5th one, they become a billionaire.
Yep. There's so many stories like that.
And so the criticisms of the risky governance and the just the crazy risk tolerance are real. We're not, this show's obviously for entertainment purposes only. But the thing that I think everybody should take away from Masa is that extreme radical optimism.
Yep.
And he's
the ability to be a deal maker.
Yeah,
it's really just a story of deal making, in my opinion. It's so
tech
underrated. In
tech mogul without seemingly ever writing a line of code.
Maybe in the very early days.
When he was.
But very quickly moved to just how do I assemble capital effectively?
Yeah.
How do I put the puzzle pieces together?
This is Sam Altman too. This is probably why
Elon hired Gwen Shotwell to run SpaceX. It's fantastic. It doesn't take away. It actually adds to their abilities. It's leverage. It's leverage for the team, for the mind. It's fantastic. Well, that wraps up our deep dive on Masa Son and SoftBank.